Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our weekly COVID-19 Town Hall. My name is Tamisha Kronick, and I am one of the HR and training managers here at iVET360. Our goal with these town halls has been to provide you all with veterinary-specific information based on real-world scenarios that many of our hospitals are facing right now. Let's see, move the slide. There we go. So our goal with these town halls, like I said, is to provide you all with vet-specific information. Today on our call or on our webinar, we will be discussing some financial measures during the COVID crisis, and we have a special guest for that portion. Oliver Roller, our Managing Director of Finance and Analytics, will walk you through some important financial pieces to keep in mind. We are also seeing many hospitals that are contemplating or have already begun the process of furloughs, layoffs, or reduction in their workforce. So we will discuss some strategies and best practices of working through that challenge. Lastly, we understand that many, if not all of you, are under an enormous amount of stress. So I'll share some tips on staying on top of your stress and managing a team during these unprecedented times. We will be answering questions a little differently today. So instead of a typical Q&A, we will be providing answers to very broad categories of common questions. With this method, we will hopefully answer nearly all of the most frequently asked questions that came through with the registration process. And then if we don't get to the question you sent in today, we will try to answer them in one of our follow-up webinars. In addition, we have Heather manning our questions feed on the webinar. She is our Managing Director of HR and Training. So you're welcome to ask questions as we go through the presentation, and she will answer as many as possible. If you want to ask a question, use the questions tab of your control panel instead of raising your hand. We won't see if you've raised your hand, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible today. All right, now I will go ahead and hand the control over to Oliver to get us started.
Thanks, Tamisha. So on the front end of this presentation, as Tamisha mentioned here, we're going to talk about some financial measures you guys can be working on or applying to your business to help you manage through this COVID-19 crisis. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the CARES Act. That is that multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package that was passed towards the end of March, really put in place to help you through this crisis. There's a couple things in there that are of importance. One is kind of the capital assistance, so how to get some money into your business from the government to help you through this crisis. There's two portions of that we'll cover today. One is the Paycheck Protection Program. That is the $349 billion provision within the Act that we'll talk about. And the other is the expanded economic injury disaster loan piece in there as well. And that's for about $10 million as well to get some additional assistance. Also within the CARES Act, there are a couple other things to consider. One is the payroll tax deferment provision in there, as well as the employee retention credit as well. So we'll be talking about those. And then finally, we're going to close on the financial measures section with talking about things outside of government support, and that is controlling your controllables in the practice during times of slow revenue and uncertainty. So first off, the Paycheck Protection Program, and this is the $349 billion piece to the CARES Act. And the folks that can apply are most of you, likely. And so small businesses, nonprofits, veteran organizations, and tribal businesses can apply for this. Any sole proprietors or independent contractors as well could apply for this on their own. You need to be less than 500 employees, and you need to be operational on February 15th, 2020. And then no owners of the business can currently be in bankruptcy proceeding as well. That's another stipulation around that. So where to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program? This particular provision is all handled through local banks and credit unions. So ultimately the funds will run through the SBA, but for the Paycheck Protection Program, you are not directly applying through the SBA.gov website. So as far as action you can be taking today, if you are going to be taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program, is making sure you're talking to your local bank. There's a high chance that your local bank may be helping to process these Paycheck Protection Programs, and they'll help you through the application process. So there's also some higher chance that if you already have an established relationship with your local bank, there's a higher chance of faster processing of these Paycheck Protection Programs right now. So business is open right now for applications into the Paycheck Protection Program. If you have been keeping an eye on the news lately, the rollout of this particular provision has been a bit clunky, and there's a lot of uncertainty still around this. But going directly to your local bank and applying through them is going to give you the best information needed, as well as best understanding of timing. At this point, we do not know when funds are actually flowing to businesses, but it's important to be ahead of it as much as possible and make sure you're applying as soon as possible to be ahead of the curve. If your local bank is not participating, then you go to sba.gov and they have a website there to be able to look for participating banks in your area that might be helping to process these Paycheck Protection Programs. So as far as the loan details, the loan amount for this Paycheck Protection Program is 2.5 times your average monthly payroll for 2019. Monthly payroll is defined as your wages, PTO, family, parental, medical, PTO, health insurance, retirement benefits, and state and local payroll tax. This is maxed out at $10 million as the cap. There's also a caveat to this that salaries beyond $100,000 are not part of the calculation. This isn't to say that if you have an employee that's making $120,000, you completely remove them from the calculations. It's actually saying that you'd remove $20,000 of that from the calculation. So instead of counting $120,000 towards the calculation, you count $100,000 towards the calculation. So as far as action to be taking today, if you are going to be taking advantage of this Paycheck Protection Program, I'd start calculating what your average monthly payroll is for 2019 to be able to get exactly kind of what your loan amount is going to be to get you through these rough waters here. So some other pieces that are going to be required for the loan is your 940 and 941 tax forms. So go ahead and start collecting those right away, all the way to the back to the start of 2019. And then, in QuickBooks, your payroll summary reports are going to be a good starting point to understand and kind of line item out all your employees in the business and start helping with those calculations. So basically, if you have total payroll costs for 2019, you divide that by 12 to get it by month, and you'd multiply that by 2.5 to understand what your loan amount is for the Paycheck Protection Program. As far as the details around the loan, this is a 2-year term for the loan, and it is a 1% interest rate. Loan payments are deferred for 6 months. So if you got the loan today in April, your first payment wouldn't be until October. And one thing of note is interest does start accruing at date of loan origination. A really cool piece around this is that there's no collateral, no personal guarantees, no credit where else tests or cash flow assessments that are being done. So this really is attempting to get money in hands of business owners very quickly. And the whole application process is not very robust as you might have with, say, a traditional bank loan. So making sure that you have allowable uses of this loan is important in the loan forgiveness, which is a very important aspect of the Paycheck Protection Program. Allowable uses of this Paycheck Protection Program are payroll costs, health insurance, rent, utilities, and interest expenses for any interest that was insured prior to the covered period. So as I mentioned, the loan forgiveness part of this particular Paycheck Protection Program is a really neat feature, and this effectively is a situation where the potentially 100% of the entire loan can be completely erased and you are not liable for repayment of that. Of course, there's caveats to this. You need to document and make sure that the use of this loan is going towards the allowable expenses that I mentioned in the previous slide. And these are those expenses during the 8-week period from February 15th, 2020 through June 30th, 2020. One stipulation around this is that 75% or more of the total loan forgiveness needs to be going towards the use of payroll, or put another way, allowable expenses cannot exceed 25% of the total forgivable amount. Again, this is called the Paycheck Protection Program. So the goal here really is to help keep salaries flowing to your employees. That's why they put this emphasis on the 75% or more of forgivable amount to go towards payroll. The forgiveness amount also can be adjusted based on differences in the FTE rate at the start of the loan versus towards the end of the particular loan. Also, if there is a more than 25% reduction in staff salaries, there will be an adjustment of what is forgiven or not. Again, these are put in place to help try to keep folks employed. And that's why there's stipulations around the FTE and the reduction of more than 25% in salary. There is still a lot of gray area around this particular piece, but the important thing to be doing today is starting to document everything for this 8-week period to prepare for loan forgiveness. So any PTO you're paying out, any sort of benefits, make sure everything's very buttoned up as far as documentation. So as we get more guidance around the loan forgiveness and how that all works, you'll be able to move quickly to make sure a portion of your loan is forgiven. So the next one is the Revised Economic Injury Disaster Loan, EIDL. This is definitely more of a traditional loan. So again, a very similar profile of businesses that can apply as the PPP. This one is handled a little differently, and that is you apply directly through the SBA.gov website, not your local bank. So if you were going to be taking advantage of the EIDL, you're going to want to work that through the SBA.gov website. As far as the loan details, max loan on the EIDL is $2 million. The rate is 3.75 for businesses and 2.75 for nonprofits. Up to 30-year terms on this note. Again, more of a traditional loan. Same thing around the personal guarantees. So if your loan amount is greater than $200,000, personal guarantees will be required. Another aspect of this particular loan that is different from the PPP is that it's not forgivable. This is a more traditional loan from a definitions perspective. One cool feature of the EIDL is that it does provide some cash in a very quick manner. So effectively, you could receive $10K within 3 days of filling out the application. If you end up going through the PPP and not EIDL, that $10K can be forgiven as well and not have to be paid back as well. So that is one cool aspect of the EIDL in that you can get some money quicker, although the application process is a bit more cumbersome than the PPP at this point. So for small businesses, we do believe the PPP is going to be the better route mostly because probably is going to be able to process quicker and it's a bigger pool of funds to be working with, and the application process is quite fast as well. But the EIDL is also an option for you should you need it. So let's talk about some other pieces around the CARES Act. One is a provision called the Payroll Tax Deferment. And this was put in place as an option to defer your Social Security tax payments through the end of the year. So that's the 6.2 you're paying towards Social Security. How it works basically is the repayment of that is due in 2 equal payments at the end of 2021 and the end of 2022. I'll caution you, this is a deferred payment, so this is not forgiven. You do have this liability you need to pay at the end of next year and the end of the following year. So this is something you really need to make sure you're planning appropriately to make sure you do have that funds available towards the end of the year, that we're not catching yourselves in a tight margin situation. The other one is the employee retention credit, and this provision allows for a credit of 50% of Social Security tax paid to employees during the crisis. You do have to be an eligible business for this particular one, and that is defined as a business that has taken a 50% or more reduction in revenue during the crisis. So, you know, if you're down in revenue by 5, 10%, or even 20%, this would not be a liable option for you, a viable option for you. And then also you have to be 100 employees or less as defined here. So as far as actions to take here, we definitely recommend talking to your accountant about these particular tax implications before taking any other action. You really need to make sure you're planning appropriately for these particular tax implications, or it could come back to bite you later on. So really the next one is kind of non-governmental support, and that is the action you can be taking in your hospital today. As I mentioned, there is a lot of unknowns right now against this recently passed CARES Act, specifically around the PPP. We do not know when hospitals are going to be funded and when the dollars will actually start flowing. So our recommendation right now is making sure you're managing the business as if PPP will not happen. So that means you're managing your business based on the revenue that's being generated in the hospital, specifically payroll and cost of goods. If we're not actively managing these, we're going to see some very tight margins very quickly. So payroll and COGS represent 60+% of your costs. And if you're not adjusting your payroll costs and your cost of goods purchasing based on reduced revenue, these numbers will increase very dramatically, very quickly. So you'll want to make sure you're managing this based on the revenue being generated and not hoping that by next week we're going to get some money from the PPP, because we just don't know when that's going to happen. So we do have some free tools and tips on how to reduce staff costs. I know Tamisha is going to talk about that as well. But the COVID-19.iVET360.com website, that has links to some free tools to help you manage your COGS in a more effective manner based on the revenue being generated, as well as your payroll. So be sure to visit that website on some free tools for you guys there. Also, some things to be considering today is talking with your landlord about rent deferment. A lot of places right now are allowing for some delays in payments of your rent. So make sure you're talking with them about that. Also, make sure you're talking with your bank about any loan payment deferment as well. A lot of banks right now are taking some pressure off businesses by deferring loan payments for a few months at least. So make sure if you've got a note in place currently that you're chatting with them about deferment options. And then of course, be checking with your insurance to see what sort of support they might have as well during these emergency times that we're dealing with right now with COVID-19. So with that, I'll pass you guys back off to Tamisha.
All right, thank you, Oliver. So with the spread of COVID-19, many veterinary hospitals are strategizing on what to do when employees have either stopped coming to work, or customers are staying away or reducing their visits. Options for hospitals include shift reductions, furloughs, temporary layoffs, reductions in force or RIFs, and even hospital closures. So let's look at some alternatives to layoffs and RIFs. Unfortunately, veterinary hospitals can't tell employees to work from home, so practice owners and managers may have to take steps to have fewer workers in the hospital at any one time to reduce contagion in the workplace. So there are scheduling options that could allow you to keep employee numbers down or that would allow you to accommodate that same output with a smaller workforce. Staggered shifts, for example, could limit the number of employees interacting and reduce the likelihood of transmission. We've also seen hospitals work with a skeleton crew and have 2 or more teams to keep employees more separated. Reducing hours can work to spread the economic consequences of cost cutting among all employees rather than just targeting a few team members. Furloughs are an alternative to a layoff. That requires a reduction in hours or a specific amount of unpaid time off. So for example, full-time employees may be asked to work only 4 days per week instead of 5 for a specified period of time. Another option is a work share program. This program involves asking or mandating that employees reduce their hours worked and share duties with other employees in that department. This approach is often viewed as an alternative to a furlough or a RIF, and there are several state unemployment departments, Arizona, California, Colorado, to name a few, that have work share programs available. These allow participating employers to have the employees receive unemployment compensation while also working part-time. If you're interested in a work share program, you would need to apply through your state's office to gain approval to participate, and then you would also send in a list of employees that are having their hours reduced. Another alternative to layoffs is to adopt a voluntary separation program. So VSPs are a good way to reduce the risks of legal liability that come with terminating employees. Most hospitals have employees who are usually in a far better situation to be laid off than others. So a voluntary separation program would allow such people to take the place of someone else that might be slated for a layoff. This allows the practice to minimize the impact of downsizing, again, by allowing those who want to volunteer to be separated. All employees would be given equal consideration, so that includes exempt and non-exempt, if they were interested in participating in this program, if it were happening in an area where the workload is being reduced, for example. This process must be initiated by the hospital. This is important to remember, not the employee. If an employee approaches a hospital and asks to be laid off, that is essentially them quitting. So in order for something like this to be considered part of a voluntary separation or a voluntary RIF, it needs to be started or initiated by the hospital. So if the hospital finds that because of a lack of work or a lack of funds that they need to reduce the number of employees, the first step is to seek the necessary staff reductions through the voluntary method. So for example, you realize through your planning and projecting that you need to eliminate 5 employees. You then offer the entire hospital or the entire team or department the opportunity to participate in a voluntary RIF. Then the hospital owners and managers would approve the voluntary separations. So if there are more volunteers than needed, and let's say all are an equally good match, the hospital will process voluntary RIF applicants in some sort of predetermined factor. So maybe that's, based on seniority or lack of seniority, but whatever the case, you'll want to make sure that that has been predetermined before you announce this to the team. So what documentation do you need? Approved volunteers should be issued a RIF separation notice that they can use to claim unemployment benefits. The notice will also document any details of their separation. And then volunteers should sign a statement that they realize that the action is irrevocable once they've been issued a RIF separation notice. However, if the hospital wants, they may cancel the action if necessary. All right, so how do you know if you've come to the point where you need to really consider layoffs or RIFs? The implications of layoffs and RIFs are far-reaching for any practice and its team members, and the decision is going to require an honest and in-depth evaluation of the potential pluses and minuses involved. This demands a clear-eyed look at the facts and possible alternatives, as well as a certain amount of soul-searching. I mean, having to let go of people is one of the most difficult parts of the job, even when it's clear that it's a necessary step. We also know that a layoff or a RIF is going to affect the morale of the employees who remain on the job. As tough as layoffs can be, it's possible to do them in such a way that's going to make it easier on everyone. You'll want to ensure that the way your layoff is handled illustrates the fact that your hospital cares about them as people, both those who have been laid off and those who remain. We all know that employee emotions can run high during a layoff. It's only natural for people to stress about how they're going to pay rent or feed their family. And, then there's the prospect of having to find another job potentially. Mishandling a layoff can leave your practice open to legal action from disgruntled former employees. So you want to make sure that you handle this correctly and with a process in place. So step one would be goal setting and analysis. What outcome do you want to achieve? What's the problem? Are there alternatives? Have you explored furloughs, temporary layoffs, work share programs? Have you already run through your alternatives? Is this the right time to do something like this? What positions will be impacted by this move? So are you looking at specific departments or specific teams? And then what will this achieve? Will this get the hospital to the financial spot that it needs to be in to continue on? So careful planning and preparation are key to successfully managing a layoff. Additionally, it can be extremely hard to separate out your emotions when you're trying to make decisions based on business needs and demands. So by creating a solid plan, you can ensure that you're making the right decisions based on the goals that you've set and the analysis that you've done ahead of time. So let's talk about how you make that plan. Create your team. Talk with your managers, your leadership team, your accountant, even your iVET360 analytics manager. This team can help to identify where cuts can be made and what those cuts will achieve. You'll also want to get a better understanding of how many cuts need to be made, where these cuts will happen in specific departments like grooming and boarding, or with specific teams. Then re-examine if there are other courses of action. Can you hold a voluntary RIF like we had just talked about, or a voluntary retirement? Any reductions that can be done voluntarily should be thoroughly inspected. Then completely lay out your budget to make sure that your plan hits all the proper places and gets you back on track. There's no point in holding a RIF if you're still going to be in the weeds when this is all over. So this can be extremely disengaging for your hospital leaders, but also for your remaining team members. Next, create an initial timeline. When do you need to make this happen? Once decisions on who to lay off are in place, how quickly can you move? And what are the costs of any delays? Lastly, and this is super important, you'll want to document everything. You'll want to document your financial goals. You'll want to also document how you've selected those to be laid off or RIF'd. Put everything into a document that you can send to your legal team for review if needed. And then all of this is, ultimately to ensure that we're following all local, state, and federal laws. All right. So you've determined that a layoff is in fact unavoidable. Now the question of who to lay off looms large. Because the selection framework for that decision can expose you to the risk of lawsuits, it's critical to take steps to ensure that the choices that you make do not adversely affect employees in one or more categories such as race, age, gender, or disability. The most reliable way to accomplish this would be to establish criteria that are objective, measurable, and that correspond to your legitimate need to implement a reduction in force. So that brings us to step 3, layoffs and RIF selection. First, you need to establish criteria. Will you be laying off just a specific department, such as kennel or grooming, due to a reduction in business in those areas? Or do you know that based on your planning and analysis that you need to reduce your workforce by, say, 20%? How many employees is that? And are you going to be spreading that out amongst the whole hospital? Or do you specifically need to maybe keep your patient care teams, but find that you can reduce your reception team? So again, the first step is to establish that criteria. Next, create a team to go through this process. Of course, this will involve key hospital leaders, so the practice managers and the owners. Then create a list of employees and where they fall within your criteria. Make sure that your teams review this thoroughly. So you'll want to select your ranking factors. For example, are you using tenure or the last performance reviews? You can use multiple factors and then assign each factor a weight based on importance. For example, you can make your selection based on tenure, their reviews, and then even their like full-time or part-time employment classification. So I'm going to run through a few methods of how to do that in the next few slides. So then you're going to review any WARN issues for your state. So for those of you who aren't aware, the WARN Act was passed by Congress in 1988. It's a law that protects employees and families and communities by requiring employers in certain situations provide 60-day advance notice of either a business closing or mass layoffs. Certainly the WARN Act does not apply to every workplace, but if it applies to yours, you'll want to know, not only for the sake of your employees, but also to protect your company from fines and penalties that could result from violating any of the WARN Act mandates. So just double check that. And then lastly, prepare layoff or RIF notices for those employees who are being laid off. You can find samples here today. And actually, I'm gonna kind of back up a little bit. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but we do have a handouts section in the control panel where you can find the handouts for RIF notices, layoff notices. There's also a guide to conducting the layoffs with a checklist. And then we've also added in there the Families First Coronavirus Act poster that should be displayed in all of your hospitals. So you can find the samples there, but also if you want, these samples will be available on our COVID-19 resource page, which is posted there on the webinar. All right, so going back to ranking factors when preparing for layoffs. Obviously, bottom line considerations typically drive a layoff decision, but at the end of the day, it's really about people. Treating people with respect and kindness really does go a long way towards making a difficult situation easier. Let people know that they're being let go not because they weren't good employees, but rather because the hospital's finances, with the current situation we're in, left no other choice. And there really is no one-size-fits-all formulation or formulation in figuring out who you're going to lay off, but by establishing criteria and creating a ranking, this can really help you arrive at an approach that's going to best serve your hospital and your employees. So with method one, this would be the seniority-based selection method. Basically, you would lay off employees based on shortest tenure at your hospital. This method is easy and it helps avoid age discrimination. However, it can be overly simplistic, and it wouldn't help avoid other types of potential discrimination. For example, if your two newest employees were both pregnant, that may raise eyebrows. Method two, employee status-based selection. So with this method, you would lay off employees based on their part-time status or some other employee classification status. This method is easy and can help better manage your brand because you're keeping on potentially better invested or engaged employees. However, you may need to combine this with a different method. This method may not make a big enough impact on finances if you don't have, for example, enough part-time employees to lay off. All right, method three is a merit-based selection method. Here you would lay off your poorest performing employees. This can help get rid of poor performers and can be easy to execute if you have recent performance reviews. Unfortunately, performance reviews can be subjective and this can lead to legal liability. Also, this doesn't take into consideration a balance of departments. For example, with this method, there is the potential to lay off more folks from one department and thus create an imbalance in your hospital. Method four is based on skills. Here you would retain employees with skills that are most impactful to your hospital and then lay off those that don't have those skills. This helps keep talent in areas that are helping to improve your hospital's bottom line. However, this can also be subjective and can lead to legal liability. Method 5 is where you use multiple criteria for ranking your employees. To do this, you would create a weighted formula that puts emphasis on criteria that are most important to your hospital, and then lay off employees who rank lowest. The benefit of this method is that you'll be able to customize this to reflect the factors that are most important to you. However, it can be difficult to set up, and you'll still want to test this against discrimination laws. So again, there's just no one-size-fits-all approach to layoffs, but by establishing criteria and creating a ranking, you can arrive at a layoff decision that's going to best serve your hospital and your current needs. All right. Now that we've figured out who we are laying off, the final step is step 4, considering severance packages and outplacement support. There is no legal requirement that says you must offer a severance package. However, keep in mind that during these unprecedented and uncertain times, a severance package can help ease the anxiety of layoffs for both the former employee and for you as employers. In general, severance packages, in general, severance pay is usually based on length of employment. For example, it could be a week's pay for every year of service, or it could be some other amount that you determine to be fair. If a severance package is being provided, usually it's paid as a lump sum, or it can be paid out over several weeks. Also, keep in mind that a severance package does not always have to be monetary. It could include health insurance coverage for a certain period of time, or a continuation of other employee benefits. If the layoff is temporary, you may already be maintaining certain benefits for the employee, but if the layoff is permanent, you would cease all benefits. So that's where a severance package that includes some of those benefits could come in. You'll also want to ensure that any severance package you offer is fair and consistent to all of those being laid off. So for example, you should not offer a severance package to some of those laid off, but not to others if you're doing a group reduction in force or a group layoff. Also, with a group RIF, employees would not negotiate their severance package. So it's important to keep things fair and consistent here. Next, consider holding a meeting before the layoff that basically explains to your staff what is happening, how the layoffs will be carried out, and it gives them time to ask questions. Honesty is the best policy when it comes to a layoff or a reduction in force. So establish and prepare meeting times to notify those being let go. Ideally, these would be done in person, but if there are circumstances around them not being able to come in, you may consider doing this virtually. Still, I think best practice is to do this in person. Either way, you'll want to ensure privacy and have a way for them to turn in any hospital property or collect any belongings. And then lastly, you'll want to communicate the layoffs to the rest of the team. It's important to remember that just because someone wasn't let go in a layoff, that doesn't mean that they're not worried that they'll be next, or that they're not upset that they got to keep their job while their friends are now unemployed. All right, so even if you are trying to stave off a RIF by using furloughs or temporary layoffs, employees really can read between the lines, and they'll be able to guess that the business is somehow failing. So how you handle and how you message this is going to be really important. Feel free to explain to your remaining team what happened and why. Explain that your employees are valued and that you value their commitment in making the business operate. Acknowledge that it's normal to feel anxious during these uncertain times. You'll want to announce what personnel changes have occurred, and then, if appropriate, explain any department reorganization or redefine any roles. And you'll also want to discuss any impact this has on workload or workflow. Promoting teamwork during this time can really help the surviving staff cope with the increased stress. And then you can ask for suggestions for improving department effectiveness and efficiency. Assure staff members that no other positions will be affected at this time, but only do that if it's true. If things are rocky and there might still be more layoffs coming, explain that finances are shaky. If the layoff was due to some other reason, explain that. But whatever you do, don't try to pull a fast one. Our teams are smart. They'll see right through it. If you have an employee assistance program, this is a great time to remind your team that it's available. And then maintain an open door policy so employees can come to you for guidance and support. Lastly, I think it's important to express optimism for the future and to end on a positive note. Stress that the staff are valued and that stress that they're valued and important, and that you'll get through these challenging times together. If you hit all these points in a small, quick speech, you should be able to help alleviate the anxiety of your remaining team. Okay. So right now, I know nearly all veterinary practice owners and managers that I've been chatting with are dealing with difficult and stressful decisions. You're working to keep your doors open and to minimize the effects of COVID-19 on your teams. Unfortunately, many of you are having to lay off team members who have families to feed. You know, this is a really heartbreaking time to be a practice leader, and I know that many of you have come to love your teams as though they were family. Compassion fatigue has been a hot topic in the vet field for some time now, and it's especially important to consider it now when we are having to take care of our patients and our teams and our families. I mean, any individual person would struggle with the amount of stress that you guys as practice leaders are carrying on your shoulders. So essentially, compassion fatigue is a secondary stress that occurs from an intense desire to help others. It's characterized by both emotional and physical exhaustion and a decrease in the ability to empathize. Unfortunately, these symptoms usually end up manifesting in ways outside of the primary stressor. This means you may be having more arguments with your friends and family, a lack of patience, frequent or more severe headaches, problems with sleep, and maybe a lack of self-care. We wanted to share with you some ways that you can prevent compassion fatigue and how to combat that feeling of being overwhelmed either at home or at the hospital. So practice self-care. One of the best ways to prevent compassion fatigue is to take care of yourself. I know this can take a large amount of effort, especially if you are a caretaker for others at home. But just make sure to eat a balanced, nutritious diet, make time for exercise, or do other things to stay active, maintain a routine sleep schedule, and then work to reduce negative thoughts, like, try confining your worries to a journal. Set emotional boundaries as well. Sometimes we can feel as though our clients' problems or our employee problems are our problems, and it's important to understand that our ability to solve the problems of others is limited. You can't solve everyone's problems all the time, nor should you try. So it's okay if you just have to listen. You can tell your team that you don't know the answer or that you don't have a solution. Engage in hobbies. This is an important aspect of balance. Be sure that you're taking the time to participate in hobbies, ideally those that still allow for social distancing. So if your hobby is painting, set aside time to paint every day. If your hobby is to Netflix and chill with your puppy or kitty, then make sure that you're getting in some quality TV time. It's easy to feel guilty for taking time for ourselves, but it is one of the most important things that we can do to defend our emotional state. Use positive coping strategies. So being at home with our families can be enough to drive some of us crazy. And now we're doing it more than usual, and we don't have many options to get away. Plus, we're having difficult conversations and having to make difficult decisions at work. This can be really easy to dive into negative coping strategies, such as emotional overeating, sleeping all day, or even self-harm. So just make sure we're using positive ways to deal with all of the stress. And then things at work may be different. So creating work strategies is going to be really important. Be sure that you're taking regular breaks, eating and drinking at regular intervals, or taking time to just walk around the neighborhood. I know working for 10 hours without a break is really going to increase stress and decrease productivity. It's also going to increase your chances of making mistakes, and it sets a bad example for your team. So just remember, it's okay to walk away for a few minutes. Create a routine at home. So watch out for your weekends and your days off. I know right now there's just not a lot to do, and it can get really isolating and exhausting being stuck at home all the time. So when you are home, try to stick to routines and create some structure in your day. Plan your day on your calendar. Uncertainty and unstructured time can really lead to unraveling. And then I think this is really important. Avoid fact flooding. I feel like everywhere we look right now, we're being flooded with information about COVID-19. It's on the news, it's on social media, it's really impacting our daily lives. As hard as it is, try to limit your exposure to the news right now. Or at the very least, just be really intentional about where and when you're getting your news from. Laugh out loud. Laughter is the best medicine. Try to find something funny and laugh out loud every day. Personally, I try to watch my favorite comedy every evening instead of the news. Maybe you encourage your team to share some funny jokes or stories during a meeting or a huddle. Just make sure to keep it HR appropriate. And then lastly, reframe your mindset. A great way of doing this is to either text yourself or email yourself or just jot down 3 good things in your life that you are grateful for. You can also work on changing your language. So I personally have been working on this as well. Use the phrase, I get to, rather than I have to, as a start for reframing. So for example, I get to come to work instead of I have to come to work, or I get to spend more time with my family. I get to try telemedicine. So just remember, many people are fearful or uncomfortable discussing how they feel, and we usually just try to distance ourselves from our emotions, especially when we're at work. However, this is not the time to be hiding behind a stiff upper lip. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, or if you feel that your emotions are becoming too much, just don't hesitate to reach out to a mental health professional or your general healthcare provider. They can provide you with references if you're not sure where to look. Your insurance company may offer an employee assistance program that you can contact for help as well. Additionally, there are e-therapy providers out there. You can maintain physical distancing and get help on your schedule. So just remember, you're not alone in this. And, we're all in this together. Every business in the world is affected by COVID-19 right now. So hopefully you all have found the information provided here helpful. As a reminder, the presentation and slides will be available on our iVET360 COVID resource page. And so now we're going to go through some questions and answers. Basically, we're going to address the commonly asked questions that we've received through the registration process. So we're going to try our best to get to all of the questions that are submitted, but if we're not able to, we will touch on them at one of our future town hall meetings. And then, of course, just feel free to reach out through our iVET360 COVID resource page. All right, let's get to some answers. So question 1, my employee has tested positive for COVID-19. Now what? So this is interesting because I feel that when this first started, there was a lot of differing information out there, and even the CDC information has changed. So the current CDC guidelines basically are to first separate your infected employees, so require them to leave work. They should follow the CDC recommended steps, and they should not return to work until they've met the criteria to discontinue home isolation. So those criteria are 72 hours has passed with no fever and without the use of fever-reducing medications. There's an improvement in their symptoms, and that it's been at least 7 days since their first symptoms appeared. And then, just remember with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that this sick time will be paid as part of their emergency paid sick leave. Also, you're going to want to contact local health authorities about the employee's illness because they'll be able to help collaborate with you on steps that you should take to inform others who may have been exposed to the virus. So that brings us to informing fellow employees. The rule of thumb is that you can and most likely must disclose that an employee has tested positive. You'll alert other employees who've had recent contact with the ill employee, as well as, other folks, maybe customers or vendors. Just be careful to not disclose too much personal information. You want to disclose just enough so that they're able to assess, the other workers are able to assess their own personal health and their potential to exposure. I know that in veterinary hospitals, we're typically a small, tight-knit community there, and it can be really challenging to keep that kind of stuff confidential. Just remember the preferred approach is to not name the individual who has tested positive, even if the sick employee is obvious is obvious in the context of the situation. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you're doing enhanced cleaning and disinfection in the hospital after you've had a person that either was suspected to have COVID or has been confirmed with COVID. And there are CDC guidelines around cleaning and disinfecting that you can check out on their website. All right, I don't know what happened here. Let's see. Question 2, can I lay off salaried employees? So the answer is yes. Layoffs don't discriminate. Salaried employees can absolutely be laid off. They can be furloughed. It's just important to remember that when a layoff occurs with a salaried employees, you need to be mindful that the layoff doesn't create a partial work week. So, you'll want to make sure that you lay them off at the end of a work week or prior to the beginning of a new work week. And if the salary employee does return to work, you'll also want to make sure that their first day back coincides with the beginning of a work week. And then you're just going to follow the same process for that layoff as you would with any other employee. Question 3, my DVMs are working less. How do I fairly compensate them? So this is going to vary from practice to practice as there are variables in how doctors are compensated. Commonly, I see most hospitals using a ProSal setup. And so with that, you may reduce base pay based on the number of fewer hours that the doctor is working. So for example, if they're working 20% fewer hours, you would cut their base pay by 20%. And then ideally, you would still be paying them production. So question 4, what are some ways we can conserve PPE? So the easiest way to refrain from, is to refrain from doing procedures that would require the use of PPE. You can postpone elective procedures or non-emergency surgeries. Some states already have an order in place to stop non-emergency surgeries to conserve PPE. You could, look through the FDA guidelines, but you could safely extend the use of disposable PPE. Most PPE is designed to be used only once by a single person prior to disposal, but the FDA, the CDC, and OSHA are recognizing that there's a shortage, and they've put out guidelines on how to safely reuse PPE if it's necessary. Oh, and then utilizing cloth gowns, cloth masks, all of those, or not all of them, but there have been some studies that have shown that well-fitting cloth masks do provide sufficient protection against surgical site infections. So, that could be a consideration as well. I know I've seen a lot of stuff out there on YouTube and things where folks are making their own cloth masks. So that's another option. Question 5, for the emergency FMLA, would the first 10 unpaid days be calendar days or work days? So right now, the assumption is in the HR world that if you, or since you're able to take this on an intermittent basis, then the same rules as FMLA apply. So for the first 2 weeks being unpaid, because it's written as the first 2 weeks unpaid, the assumption is that it means the first 2 calendar weeks. This right now seems to be the popular opinion in the HR world. However, as this rolls out and we get more guidance from the Department of Labor, this could potentially change. All right, so what documents do I need to require of my employees if they're going to use emergency paid sick leave or expanded family leave? So this is the latest information from the Department of Labor. When you have employees requesting this time off, you'll want to document this. You'll want to have them document this in a request to you guys, or you can document this somehow, but you're going to need their name, the dates for which leave was requested, the reason for leave, and then a statement as to why the employee was unable to work. If they are requesting leave based on a quarantine or an isolation order, then they would also want to provide the name of the government entity that issued that order. So, also I think it's important to point out that when we think about the reasons why somebody might be using the emergency paid sick leave, I think the first reason is that there is a quarantine order or an isolation order. Those orders would be orders that are directed towards the individual and not the community. So for example, a just community general shelter in place order would not necessarily qualify, but if there was a government order, or a local state order for that particular individual to quarantine, then that's what would qualify. So we're going to want the name of the government entity that issued that order. And then so for self-quarantine, if that's based on their healthcare provider, either they have a note from their healthcare provider or it's just based on the advice of their healthcare provider, we're going to want the name of their provider. And then if you have any employees who are requesting to use the expanded family leave, then we will want to know, you'll want to have documented the name of the child, the name of their school or their child care, and then just a statement from them that there's no other suitable person available to help out. Question 7, and this is our last question because we are just about up on time. I have an employee that was sick and is better now, but my team is afraid to work with them. So this is tough. Of course, fear and anxiety about a disease can lead to social stigma towards others. And I think, as leaders, it's really important that we try to mitigate this as much as possible. So, maintain privacy and confidentiality of your team and their health concerns. It's important to stop any negative statements that you are hearing or seeing that are taking place in your hospital. Be on the lookout for signs of members that might be stigmatized. So some groups might include persons of Asian descent, people who have traveled recently, people who either maybe they work with first responders or healthcare workers that are on the front lines. So we just want to make sure that we are speaking out against negative behaviors and not letting that happen in the workplace. You can raise awareness about the virus without increasing fear. So share as much, facts as you can about the virus. And then I think it's important just to remember that stigma hurts everyone. It creates fear and anger towards other people, and it affects the emotional and mental health of those that are being targeted. So I think this is pretty common. I feel like I have a lot of hospitals that are asking me about this, and it's really up to you guys as leaders to prevent this from happening in your hospital and among your team. All right, so we have made it to the end of our presentation. Thank you guys again for attending today's town hall. We love being able to help our veterinary community, and this is just one of the ways that we thought of that can help ease some of the stress for you guys. Heather Romano will be leading next week's webinar. She's going to go over some updates around the CARES Act and around the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. We will also have someone from our marketing department go over some best practices around keeping clients coming to you guys. So be sure to tune in next week. Next week's webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 15th at noon Pacific time. We will also try to answer as many questions as possible that we might not have been able to get to today. On behalf of everybody at iVET360, I just really want to thank you all for everything that you guys are doing to keep your doors open and to help pets and pet owners in your community. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy.